Okay, so I have just imported my Photogrammetry Apple into Zbrush from an FBX file. I'm just going to left-click drag on my viewport and drop it onto the canvas. At this point, I obviously need to press T to get into edit mode, and I'm going to come over to material and just use the flat color. And now I can rotate around my object. I mean, I often like to just press Shift P to get the floor, and I like to constrain around the rotation around the Y-axis and press P for perspective, and get something that feels a little bit more like a 3D app. Now here's our apple. If we go to the subtool menu, we can see some information about the apple, and we can see that it's come in with just under 500,000 polys. This is a triangulated mesh. So if I press Shift F, we can see that this mesh is triangulated. And so we also have actually almost quarter of a million points in the mesh, and also I know that this mesh doesn't have any vertex color currently, but it does have a texture, and so the color information is coming from the texture map, which is here. We can see that it's a 2K texture, and for this particular workflow, what I want to do is I want to take this texture data from a texture file and bake it into the poly paint of my object, because there are different ways in which we can bake that color information, but for this particular workflow we're going to bake into vertex color, because I would eventually put the high poly object into Substance Painter and bake the color information using vertex color. But Substance Painter will not bake a high poly texture. For that, you'd need to use a different piece of software. Substance Designer would probably do this. So to get our texture data into the high poly mesh, we need, ideally, to record all that texture information, we need similar, perhaps more points in our mesh than we have pixels in our texture. So a 2K texture has slightly in excess of 4 million pixels in it. So roughly speaking, as a rule of thumb, probably want more points, so at least 4 million points in our high poly mesh to record all of that information. So I'm just going to simply press Control D to subdivide my my apple, so it's gone up to 1.8 million now, and subdivide it again. Now we've got 5 million quad polygons. But let's sort of see actually what we have in the subtool menu. So we've got 5 million polys and 5.5 million and 5.5 million points. So that should be just about enough to record all the texture information. And so what we can do here is we can come down to the polypaint group, which is not polygroups, polypaint, which is there, and we can click on polypaint from texture, at which point we have to turn on RGB, polypaint from texture. And now at this point, I think it's a good idea to actually, we can toggle back and forth to see how good that is. So if we turn the texture on, we can see that's the information in the texture, that's the information in the poly paint. So we can see visually it's close to about the same amount of information. And I think if we zoom out and toggle between the two, we can see it's very close. And at this point, what I would do, just so we don't get so we don't end up with the UVs on the export, what I'll do is I'll turn the texture off, and I immediately go to UV map, and I would delete my UV, because if we're baking the color information into the into the vertices for vertex color, there's no point in having additional information in the form of UVs on our high poly. It's just going to inflate the size of the file. So now we have a nice high poly object with a vertex color in that we can use to bake the color information in Substance Painter. Now I'm gonna just make a right. Let's rename this to Apple. We'll call this the high, and I'm going to duplicate it. We're going to rename this to low. And I'm also going to just dynamically solo this, so I'm not actually seeing both objects at the same time. And because I'm trying to now make a low poly version of this, I'm going to turn off the subdivision, and I'm going to delete the higher subdivision levels. And now I'm going to just simply go into the geometry tab, and I'm going to Z-remesh this object. Now, you can make a choice at this point. You could go down the route of decimation and get a triangulated mesh. I think in the case of an apple, it's quite nice to have a quadded mesh, and the Z-remesher will do this and give us control over how many polygons we're going to get. So let's say if we set the target polygons to say 1K, we'll switch off adapt and we'll just press the Z-remesh button. If we just wait for a few seconds for the algorithm to finish, we should get a nicely quadded apple. And if I press Shift F, you can see what it's produced. So you can see, yeah, in this case, the Z-remesher is quite a nice option to get a nice mesh, and we could set that poly count to whatever we want. And obviously now we're in a position to go up to the Z plugin menu. We can just click on that. In fact, I like to click on this little icon to the left so that the menu sticks over here on the left hand side of the screen. And I go to UV master, and I'm going to switch off symmetry, and I'm just going to unwrap this apple like that. And because this doesn't have any subdivision history to it, I can flatten it, and we can see we get this nice sort of disc of a UV island. But obviously in this case, this might be okay depending on what you want to do with the apple, but obviously the UVs are becoming more and more distorted towards the edge of this UV island. So if I unflatten my object, we could sort of slightly improve that. I think a nice easy way of doing this would be to select half the apple like this, and we can maybe, if we just sort of paint in very quickly that, if I press Control W now, that masked area will turn into a poly group. And we can, in the UV master, we can press on poly groups and then just unwrap the poly groups. And if we flatten, you can see now we've got 2 UV islands. So we've got less distortion in the UVs here. We could further make more islands, but obviously then you can have more seams. So I think this is a nice compromise if I just unflatten that. And there we are, we have our 2 models. So at this point we can export both our high and our low versions and bake them in Substance Painter. But something that I often end up doing is I might take my low poly apple and project the poly paint from the high onto the low, especially if the mesh needs some kind of editing or repairing, filling holes and things like that. It's actually nicer to do that on a nicely quadded mesh, and this is actually quite an easy operation to do. I can quite simply, if I close the subtool, in fact no, it isn't the subtool, sorry, and we go to project down here, I can project the visible subtools onto the low poly. So if I just press the project button there, it'll ask me, do I want to project poly paint? Yes, I definitely do. And if I press Shift F to get rid of that, you can see that it's starting to bring through the poly paint. I'm just going to subdivide it once, and I'm going to press the project button again, subdivide it again, project again, subdivide again, project again. Just check on how many polys we've got. Yeah, we're still quite a way off. Project it again. And there we go. I mean, it's probably, we need to subdivide it. So we're currently on 250,000. So we'd have to subdivide it another 2 times to capture all, subdivide it another 2 times and project. Every time I subdivide, I do a projection. If you just subdivide, and then project, you run the risk of getting more garbled information or misprojection. If I press Shift F to get my wireframe up, you will often find that there will be areas of your mesh, particularly on a more complex object, where you're going to get sort of messed up areas. You can see them here. So if I reduce the size of my brush a little, you can see that there are little projection errors here where the mesh is a bit screwed up. What I tend to do in situations like this is I will press Shift to get the smooth brush, and I'll turn off RGB because I don't need to blur the RGB. I just want to smooth out these kind of jagged bits of mesh like that. Just smooth them out like that. This is quite fine detail, but you often find that sometimes that can be a bit of an issue. But it's quite easy to just smooth that out. You can see there's a projection error there in there. So we can smooth that out so it's a little bit more accurate. And then we can do it like another Control D to subdivide it again, and then project all. And each subsequent time you do this, our mesh becomes a little bit more accurate. And there we go. You can see now we've done another projection. There's still maybe a few more errors around here. We can smooth them out again. We can spend some time just going over that, just fixing the little projection errors. If I press Shift F again to get rid of that, you can see that actually that looks pretty decent. Even though we're probably still to capture all that high poly detail, we're currently on just under 100, just under 1 million polys, 1 million points. We need to subdivide it again to capture all of that detail, but it's already looking pretty decent. And now we have an object. If I press Shift D to go down in subdivision levels, we can see that we've now got one object that's got all our UVs and polypaint data in one object. And what we could do is we could export the high poly from this version of the apple, and clearly because the topology is closely related, it's going to provide potentially an even cleaner bake.